Good morning. So last week, my daughter Molly and I picked up Emma by Jane Austen. And we decided we'd work our way through it together, one chapter at a time, trading off who reads every other page. And it's no secret that I love Jane Austen. I'm part of several Jane Austen groups on Facebook. I closely follow Regency fashion recreations on Instagram, and I love the differences between all of the film adaptations, the choices that are made by each director and each costume department, each musical score. The same text can be expanded upon in ways that Austen herself never dreamed by applying a different critical lens to the screenplay, the choices in cast, the emphasis on some pieces of character development or downplaying of others. And yet, even with such differences between adaptations, each new iteration of this beloved text is still Austen's Emma. This is because the text is a living thing. It is the creation of a story does not end once the author sets down her quill with her finished manuscript. As I learned while studying literature, one does not just write about a text as though it's something that's already happened, but as though it is current, alive, thriving with each new reading. The critical lens you and I, bring to it with our own experience, or by looking for certain themes and elements, provides this fresh, ever-evolving piece of work, even though the original writer may have passed into glory centuries ago. This can also be said of reading scripture. Each time we pick up our Bibles and read through I'm passionate about talking about literary criticism, can you tell? A passage, every time we read through a passage, the text leaps forward, freeing itself from antiquity, and it becomes interwoven with our world, our perspectives. It interacts with current events. It joins us on the mat as we wrestle with societal unrest, and it presents a bridge between ancient daily life and our own routines, giving us this reassurance of continuity, even when we feel that our own world is upside down. We can take from literary criticism helpful ways to interact with scripture, to bring it to life, but it must be handled with even greater care than works of fiction. Scripture carries with it a holy tradition and offers spiritual truths, and so our interpretations of it must be multi-layered to allow for the complexity that can be found within. In literature, a formalist approach is acceptable. So reading through Emma, focusing solely on the text and the structure and the words without taking into account any of the historical context or any of the influences that Jane Austen might have had in her life or what her political leanings were, all of that can be taken out and you can just read the novel and it won't be detrimental to one's reimagining of that novel. But with scripture, however, this is a dangerous game. To merely pluck a chunk of text out of its context and apply it to our modern life without also considering the factors that went into its writing is irresponsible. We look to scripture to guide our path, to inform our spiritual growth, and to help us make decisions that are rooted in ancient tradition. Historical context is key in separating the deep wisdom found within the scriptures from the way that the scriptures interacted with the current events of a few millennia ago. How do you separate those layers and find that pearl of wisdom that is, smashed in between us, talking about a society that we don't know anything about or have not lived and are not living through? So I'm going into depth with this morning, not because I want to transform our worship service into a Literature 101 class, but because these are the skills that are necessary to a faithful reading of the Bible. If we merely wander into these texts, which are heavy with their own applications to a way of life that no longer exists, and we don't consider how their world influenced their writing, we are in grave danger of misunderstanding what is being taught in these passages. Once we have the contextual piece in place, then we can begin to apply the layers of critical interpretation to it and watch as the words become timely guides through our own context and time. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. The Bible has been used in pieces and fragments and severed from its context to promote atrocious agendas and perpetuate oppressive ways of thinking. That is just a history that we as Christians have to grapple with. A text which overwhelmingly states again and again and again to care for the poor, the oppressed, the harassed, and helpless can also be weaponized against those same groups of people if read and regurgitated without proper time spent understanding why it says what it says and separating the contextual pieces of that time that they were written. None of the versions we read are the original unless we are proficient in Hebrew, Aramaic, Biblical Greek, and other languages which the source text for our translated, canonized versions were written. We must take into consideration that words often have multiple meanings, and when translating, those meanings may shift due to inadequate words in one language to express the words from another. We read these texts realizing that for thousands of years, men were the ones to write history, to compose the written versions of oral histories that were passed down. We approach the numerous translations and remember that political motivations and alliances have served as catalysts for these books to be set in print. And yet, even with all of these factors floating about for consideration as we read, still the word lives. From our own place on the timeline, we are coming out from a week where the effects of racism on this country still dominates national headlines. There were confusing reports coming to us from the WHO about asymptomatic carriers of COVID-19, and we've had to listen and dig deeper for the facts. And all the while, bars and salons are reopening for the first time in months, and while the numbers and reported cases still climb, that's a lot to sift through. We had the devastating news about the end of protections for trans persons seeking medical care. And if we looked hard enough, or the algorithms on our news feeds were just right, we even heard about the murders of 2 Black trans women this week. We need the guidance of our ancestors, the stable and steady hand of ancient wisdom now more than ever. And we need to make sure our understanding of the wisdom is rooted faithfully rather than plucked out and used a la formalism to prove a point. Our gospel text comes to us from a point in Matthew that follows a series of healings, cleansings, and miracles. Jesus has been busy leading up to today's reading. If you back up just a chapter and a half, you'll read about Jesus encountering lepers, breaking fevers, casting out demons, curing medical ailments, restoring vision, and bringing people back from the precipice of death. It reads like the highlight reel after a sporting event. You can almost picture the camera angles on the girl, waxy and pale with death upon her, the crowd gathered to mourn. And then it cuts to a quote from Jesus saying, "Go away, the girl isn't dead, she's asleep." And then the shots of the girl hugging her parents, alive, vibrant, as the camera pans to Jesus walking quietly out the door and onto his next miracle. When we get to the reading for today, it's the summary of this highly active time of caring for those who need it the most. Those who are at risk of marginalization and poverty, the ones who would have pre-existing conditions or be denied care. The ones without formal protections built into the law about being treated. The ones entrenched in systemic violence against them because of factors beyond their control. What does Jesus have to say about this? The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Jesus isn't telling his disciples that they're about to go out and pick plums. That's not what this is. He is tasking them with a mission. He is introducing them to their new calling of compassion. This text lists them all by name, commissioning each one of his apostles to the work of casting out the ills that are plaguing the land. And he keeps this first missionary expedition close to home. He doesn't send them elsewhere. He instructs them to begin with their own people, to start the transformation among Israelites rather than going among Samaritans or Gentiles. This isn't to draw a line, because if we take this in the context of the larger body of text in Matthew and in the Gospels, we know Jesus opens up and begins ministering to non-Jewish peoples at another point in the timeline. But for now, he highlights the importance of fixing ourselves, caring for our immediate needs before we can then move beyond our own circle. This made me think of church missionary trips that take youth to other countries. I've been on a few of those. I've taken youth on a few of those. And putting kids who are wealthy enough or from affluent enough communities to afford international travel and putting them into the lap of extreme poverty for a week or two, posing for photos and giving voyeuristic saving help across continents, while then coming home and not taking that knowledge and that experience and transforming their communities. And instead, ignoring the struggles of impoverished communities right in their own backyard, in our own backyard. I'm guilty of this too. Falling back into the American individualist way of blaming people for their own lack of resources, their own moral failing that prevents them from pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. You've all heard that phrase. First, Jesus asked the 12 to understand and transform their own community. They were instructed to do this work quietly, simply, and without fanfare, not to benefit from someone else's misfortune by proving their own righteousness and stooping down so far to lift someone up. As I read this, I'm also remembering the words I have read in the last few weeks from Black activists giving white allies guidance on how to best be part of the movement for racial justice. And what I've heard in an overwhelmingly frequent cadence from the community and from what I've been reading is to do things that no one will ever know. Don't make this about you. When you attend a protest, don't take selfies for Instagram. Jesus' words, "You received without payment, give without payment," are especially poignant as we grapple with this and with what white privilege means and how we could possibly have it when we have faced hardships too. For the 12 disciples given instructions to heal and perform miraculous acts, these gifts came from God, freely given, and so they're not to expect any money in return as they invoke the privileges of casting out demons or healing long-lasting physical conditions. To do so would be extortion. And so as we look at this in our own context, we see how we are to contribute to the healing of the societal ailment of systemic racism, recognizing that we have not faced the same obstacles and oppression as others simply because of our skin color. Even though other factors have made our lives hard, they were not exacerbated by those racial factors. And we are to use the privilege of being part of the dominant group in order to cast out the demons of white supremacy without expecting monetary gain or building our personal brand or a pat on the back and a plate of cookies for using something that we never had to ask for. This looks like stopping when you see a Black person being stopped by the police and using your whiteness to buffer the situation, knowing that violence may not escalate as quickly or severely if a witness from the dominant racial group is present. I know, that feels icky and awkward. I hate it too. But that's one of the realities that we keep seeing coming out of this. We don't like to think of ourselves in racialized terms, but that's only because we don't have to, because it's not a life or death situation for us. We can turn that thought off as soon as we are done guarding our feelings about racism once they've been brought up. This can also be done in providing financial assistance to organizations that are doing advocacy work without expecting to have a wing of their building named after you. It happens in the educating of one another and ourselves about oppression we have not experienced firsthand, trusting in the lived experience of those who have. Jesus had compassion for the harassed and helpless in his own community. Those words come from Matthew 9:36. And he sent the 12 to do the anonymous, unglamorous work of making things more equitable for those who were never fully integrated into society due to physical difference. And we're just going to take a quick fun aside because things have been getting pretty heated here. So to the earlier point about translations having different meanings, the Greek used to indicate the compassion Jesus felt for the harassed and helpless can be more translated as to have a stirring of the bowels. Now, we lucked out that this was taken to mean that he was overcome with this deep emotional response that he felt as a gut feeling. You know, it turned his stomach. It made him see that there was a need for action. But it's worth remembering the way it was initially written down and the difference in meaning between bowel movement that we have today and in the first few centuries after Jesus' death, and how words can have a changing evolution of their own. But to come back from that little linguistic interlude, we are Christians and we are to follow Christ's lead in all we do. This means we are, before anything else, to look around us and see who has been harassed, who is calling out in desperation, who are the people here right in our local communities that have been truly oppressed and are calling out for us to do something with the resources we have. We are to do it not for recognition or to clean our consciences, but because it is what must be done. And possibly the hardest piece of all with this is we are to expect nothing but unsettling silence in return, instead of a fruit basket or a bottle of wine with a thank you card attached. Jesus sent the 12 out without extra sets of clothes, without extra money, to be profoundly uncomfortable while performing transformative acts among their own people. As believers and lovers of Christ, we too are called to move through our personal discomfort to bring greater justice and healing to our country. God be with you as you discern for yourself how our Christian traditions are beckoning you toward such radical and transformative action. Peace be with you.